We only have one DCU update for you today. Headline, and here it is. A banner online has been posted by James Gunn of Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow, but it merely says Supergirl, no Woman of Tomorrow. Does this mean they are cutting the Woman of Tomorrow from the title? Well, in terms of film marketing, the Woman of Tomorrow aspect is a bit of a mouthful. The general audience don't give an SHIT about the Woman of Tomorrow graphic novel. They want to see a great, epic, exciting, entertaining Supergirl movie. So it could be that they've actually cut the Woman of Tomorrow out of the Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow and are merely calling it Supergirl, like they did with Superman Legacy. I don't think that's a bad thing. Now you're asking the question, does this mean they're going away from the Supergirl Woman of Tomorrow graphic novel? I don't think so. There could be rewrites being done during production and filming. They're producing and filming this movie as we speak, so anything is possible. Now, for today's main video, let's go back in time to 2013 and see David Goyer's plans for A Man of Steel 2. Welcome back to Movies TV Mad. I'm Mick, your host with the most to start your girlfriends and your wives. You can follow me on X, Twitter at Movies TV Mad, and on Instagram and on Threads at Movies TV Mad, X, TikTok, Mad Mickey's World, and Snapchat, BMouth60. Mick, your host with the most. A very warm welcome to Wednesday's edition of the DCU Daily. It is my opinion that the ousting of David S. Goyer, the screenwriter of Man of Steel, after Man of Steel, is the reason the DCEU failed. And people say to me, Mick, why do you think the DCEU went so bad? The key moment, the ousting of David S. Goyer, the guy who wrote all three screenplays for Batman Begins, The Dark Knight, and The Dark Knight Rises. Two of those three films made over $1 billion, and they ousted him because Man of Steel had a great opening, but petered out to $670 million in the global box office. Still not bad for a first try. This was the key mistake. Instead, they went for Batman versus Superman. They made a Batman and Superman movie. That was a Warner Brothers decision, not a Zack Snyder decision. They did that to make $1 billion, $2 billion. Well, karma came and kicked them in the balls because they didn't even make $1 billion for BVS. Now, I love BVS. I think it's a great movie. But it wasn't a movie that the general audience were going to gobble up. And you know, hardcore DC fans weren't going to gobble it either because of the way they wrote Batman and Superman in the movie. Despite Batman vs. Superman being a direct sequel to Man of Steel, something didn't seem right. They skipped about 18 months. So basically, they skipped Man of Steel 2. There's a story to tell there. It could still be told, right? But Henry Cavill isn't getting any younger. I like David S. Goyer as a storyteller. I love Man of Steel. It was absolutely wrong to remove him and bring in Chris Terrio, who's a great writer, who did a great job with BVS. Now, if you see the opening credits of BVS, you'll see that the screenplay was supposed to be penned by David S. Goyer and Chris Terrio. Goyer wrote a screenplay for a direct sequel for Man of Steel 2. That's why, legally, his name has to be there. David S. Goyer had nothing to do with BVS. Let's make that clear. Here's an interview with David S. Goyer, I think maybe a couple of weeks or a month after Man of Steel was released. He talks about his plans for A Man of Steel 2. David S. Goyer on Man of Steel 2, Lex Luthor, Clark's Disguise and more. David S. Goyer on Man of Steel 2, Lex Luthor, Clark's Disguise and more. In yet another interview with the Man of Steel writer, Goyer discusses the direction the sequel might go in, what incarnation of Lex Luthor we can expect to see, and how they plan on tackling Clark Kent's ludicrous civilian disguise. Warning, there are MOS spoilers ahead. Of course, this was at the time when the movie was in the cinema. Goyer didn't like the concept of kryptonite, and he thought the Glasses disguise is stupid. Just because something's stupid, it doesn't mean you can't just use your imagination and look past it. I don't think it's stupid. Clark Kent in the glasses is supposed to be the quiet guy in the back of the room. Nobody notices. Why doesn't anyone ever see the TARDIS? Because it's there, but it's not there. That's the concept of the Clark Kent disguise. Why does nobody get that? Anyway, we've heard quite a bit from Goyer about how WB's future DC movie slate might shape up now that Man of Steel has laid the groundwork. But while speaking to Bleeding Cool about the now officially planned sequel to that film, so there was a sequel planned, right? Which became Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice. That was a bad idea. I love the movie, but it was a bad idea. The writer gives a few interesting hints on how Kal-El's story could progress. It seems to be pretty much a given that we will see Lex Luthor in the next movie, and Goyer also touches on that, teasing a very different Bill Gates like Lex. And finally, he addresses the question of how Clark Kent's basic disguise will work in the future movies now that he works at the Daily Planet and has donned those glasses. On the challenges of depicting Superman in the modern world in a sequel, here's David Goyer. To me, the interesting challenge is, could he solve hunger in the Horn of Africa? What would he do with the Arab Spring? What would he do in Syria? Partly, you could argue, how could he not intervene in something like the situation in Syria? But the other argument is it a hornet's nest if her intervenes? Does he have the wherewithal or the knowledge to intervene in something like this? And actually, this is very interesting, and I think this is a topic of what Gunn is delving into in his Superman movie. We can see the boy with the flag, and basically there was a few spoilers saying that Superman does intervene in a battle in another kind of Middle East type country, and that comes to bite him back on the butt as that country attacks Metropolis in James Gunn's Superman movie. So James Gunn is going to show the consequences of interfering in other people's business, if you like. Very, very interesting. So what Goyer's kind of talking about here, Gunn's doing as well. That's why I'm not ready to totally dismiss Gunn's Superman movie. Go and watch the movie, make your own minds up. On the version of Lex Luthor, we'll likely see. There is amusing about Lex Luthor conversations that Zach and I have had on set, but it all depends on what happens over the next month. There are obviously those Lex called Easter eggs in the film, and clearly you can see from that to the extent to which we can intuit things about Lex. It's not the Gene Hackman version. This is a Bill Gates like Lex that is probably worth 50, 60, 70 billion dollars. It's a very different Lex. So basically, the Lex Luthor we saw in BVS, is that a Bill Gates? I would say maybe a young Bill Gates. I think we kind of got the version that David Goyer kind of wanted in there, if you like. I'm not sure David would have chosen Jesse Eisenberg to play the role. Eisenberg was a choice I would never have made, but he's one of the greatest actors of his generation, and his performance, whether you like his version of Lex, is outstanding. I don't mind his Lex in BVS, although it's not one of my favourite depictions of the character. On using the old school disguise, we were able to sidestep the issue of the ludicrous glasses disguise in this film, but going forwards, we're going to find ourselves in a sticky wicket. Zach and I have definitely talked about, this will be interesting. Clearly, Perry White and Steve Lombard see Lois kissing Superman at the end of the film. Perry's not an idiot. Moving forward, he's probably going to say to Lois, what's up with that? We're definitely going to have to go through some story gymnastics. Very interesting. So that's the interview. That's the interview that he did during Man of Steel still being in cinemas. A plan for a direct sequel. People will argue that Batman vs. Superman Dawn of Justice is a direct sequel to Man of Steel. It's set 18 months after that movie. It's not really a direct sequel. Yes, we see Batman's or Bruce Wayne's perspective of the Battle of Metropolis, which is great, but then we skip 18 months. basically they skip Man of Steel 2. They skip a direct solo sequel because WB believed not enough people were interested. Here's the truth about the first Man of Steel film. If there's a little less destruction, if Superman doesn't kill Zod, if that tornado sequence was executed in a different way, I believe Man of Steel would have made $1 billion. I've said this on this platform and my other platforms so many times. If certain things were adjusted, Man of Steel would have come close to $1 billion. It had a great opening. It fizzled out because of some of the goings on and events in the movie triggered hardcore Superman fans and the general audience. But ultimately, it's a bloody good movie. And if Superman doesn't kill Zod, that movie is a hit. And if that movie is a hit, David Goyer stays on the franchise and we're still getting DCEU movies. So the ousting of Goyer is a key moment. WB became reactive to the criticisms of the film instead of closing their ears to those criticisms, because there's certain issues in the film that people don't like, but there's nothing in that film that can't be fixed, if you like. You can have Superman say in the second film, as I've said before, he knows what it feels like to kill. He never wants to kill again. He's learned something. How do you learn? How do you have a no-kill policy when you're given no choice but to kill? Well, when you know what it's like to do that, it haunts you. And I would hope in A Man of Steel 2, we would see Superman having fever flashbacks to killing Zod. It should really affect him that he did that. That's something I would have loved to have seen. If I was writing the sequel, I would have gone back to that. So you can fix that. You can say, look, the guy had no choice. This is a real world Superman. He's, what's he do? And people said, well, he could have flew him up and all that. And, he's got to think quickly, right? Basically, it's very difficult for Superman because they're in this kind of lock. It's not easy for Superman just to fly up. It's easy for you as a viewer to say, well, they could have done this. And why didn't Clark save, Jonathan and all that? It's pretty obvious why. But I'm not going to defend a movie that I feel doesn't need defending. So any issues with Man of Steel 2 could have been dealt with in Man of Steel 2. It's what I said about Superman Returns, and it's what Bryan Singer said about Superman Returns in the sequel. He said, we can fix any problems with Superman Returns in a Superman Returns Man of Steel sequel. Because they penned the sequel. They were going to do a whole Brainiac story. It was going to be amazing. Twice now, because of a reactive Warner Brothers, we've missed out on a potentially fantastic sequel. And I wanted to talk about this today because I'll repeat, the ousting of Goyer, Nolan leaving and the banner of his production company going from the DCEU is the core reason that the DCEU failed. So when you see someone on the internet saying to you, why did the DCEU fail? Or try and tell you, being a smartass, why it failed. Tell them the truth. The Man of Steel was a great movie that ousted its screenwriter, and that's why the DCEU failed, right? They allowed Zack Snyder to do whatever he wanted with BVS. Great movie. But if you're a company, you're an industry. You're not just making movies. You're not just making art. You're an industry, right? And ultimately, Man of Steel is more general audience friendly than BVS is. And I think no matter how much objectivity you lack, if you're a big Snyder fan and you don't want to hear that, it's true. Man of Steel was more, mainstream than BVS. So that's why the DCEU failed, because they ousted David S. Goyer. David S. Goyer wrote a great script, Zack Snyder directed a great movie, and Christopher Nolan helped Goyer pen a great story, a contemporary Superman movie. And this is what's so interesting about James Gunn's Superman, because it looks to me that Gunn's grabbing hold of some story threads that Goyer was going to tap onto. The fact that Superman's going to interfere in a war in another country, and there's going to be consequences to the American people, to Metropolis, to the citizens of Metropolis, because of Superman's interference in unilateral affairs. Let's see how that works out on July the 11th.